beside me, Lloyd Cochran. He's an assistant professor of history at York University. Oh, that's here too. He's the author of Remember the Madoc War, Redemption, Violence, and the Making of American Innocence. The Making of American, that's interesting. University of Northern California. But his books are outside, by the way. His research focuses on the instructions of U.S. Indigenous studies and U.S. cultural history, and he is currently working on a history of Indigenous peoples' engagement with discourses of extinction since the 19th century. Some of those discourses, by the way, were advanced by some of my people who thought they were going to go extinct. It was very unusual for West Coast people to be on the losing side of things up till that point. I think that's why. Before that, we were the oppressors. But anyway, that's another story.
One of the things that I think similar with my work and Roxanne's work is studying the cycle of violence that binds the past to the present. And I spent the last 10 years working on a book on historical memories of violence in southern Oregon and northern California among the Modoc people. And so I want to dedicate my comments today to the recent people who died in the shooting at Umpqua Community College, which is in the traditional territory of many people, including the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuascan Paiute people. As I read this book, I was reminded over and over again of the great populist historian Howard Zinn's admonition, you can't be neutral on a moving train. I also thought a lot about the politics of labels. In this book, Professor Dunbar Ortiz labels American history as settler colonial, and she identifies the experience of indigenous people in the United States as genocidal. It's truly a totalizing critique. And as I read, though, I thought back to my childhood as the first son of a recent migrant from the Pacific island of Okinawa to the United States. And as a kid growing up in on the Southern California coast, under the shadow of the mission to San Buenaventura, the last mission to be established by the controversial and recently sainted Junipero Serra, I remembered loving stories about California indigenous peoples. In 4th grade, we learned how to grind acorn and weave baskets. We visited the Santa Barbara Mission with its beautiful white walls, and green lawns, and blue water. There were no indigenous peoples at those missions today, not as I recall, only dioramas and abandoned tools, as if the childlike dwellers of the Padres' haciendas had left their hoes and spades in the fields of their joyful toil. My favorite book in 4th grade was Scott Odell's The Island of the Blue Dolphin, with its romantic story of a female Robinson Crusoe, the last of her vanished race on San Nicolas Island. There was no mention or discussion of the Tonga, the still very present indigenous peoples whose culture and history Odell appropriated for his novel and who were at that moment, in the mid-'80s, when I was in 4th grade, struggling to receive state and federal recognition. As I grew older, I discovered Theodore Kroger's beautiful and loving portrait of Ishi, the last of the Yahi. Discovered dehydrated and exhausted, wandering into a slaughterhouse in Oroville, California in 1911, he spoke no English and soon became a fixture in turn-of-the-century San Francisco's. He lived in the university's museum. He worked with Kroger to earn his room and board. He entertained the public with displays of his tool-making. He became a popular attraction, and he took his guardians, Waterman and Kroger, on the camping trip of a lifetime. Anyone who's read that book knows what I'm talking about, and what adolescent me would have done to have gone along with them, to have spent a night with the last member of his tribe. And of course, we learned in elementary school, junior high, how all the California indigenous peoples, all of them, were supposedly hunted down and murdered, wiped out, annihilated in a conflagration of genocidal violence. And we learned about how Ishi himself died in 1916 from tuberculosis, and how he became renowned as California's and indeed North America's last Indian. We were raised on his discourse of extinction. He told us that indigenous people around. I carried my love of California Indigenous history with me. In high school, I learned the death and destruction that came with the gold rush, when the world rushed in and Native peoples were slaughtered. I was taught by a young, tattooed high school teacher, a recent escapee from the tarnished halls of academia, that it was genocide. And so it was in high school that I was fed these discourses. And my education then was, I think, very typical. The three pillars of Indigenous history remain, in California, remain the missions, the genocide debate, and Ishi. But Indigenous Californians and Indigenous nations throughout the United States did survive, as Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz argues in her book. They suffered tremendous cultural dislocation. They endured widespread homicide, state-sponsored relocation, concentration, and even intermittent campaigns of extermination, but they survived. Somehow, most Americans to this day don't really get that part of the story. And that is what concerns me about the so-called genocide debate in American history today, which this book wades into. Because you see, as I argued in my first book, Remembering the Modoc War, and as Professor Dunbar-Ortiz passionately argues here, an enduring narrative of American innocence, what Dunbar-Ortiz calls the founding myth of American history, pervades our standard understandings of conquest and colonization in the American West. The Modoc War of 1872-73, California's so-called last Indian War, is of course a prime example of this. A campaign of Reconstruction-era ethnic cleansing. Americans reimagined the closing act of California's frontier era as a redemptive narrative of their own innocence. They weren't the perpetrators of this violence. They were its victims. And therefore, anything that came of it was not criminal, but was justifiable. But far too often in these debates about genocide, we forget the indigenous voices amidst the accusations of criminality. Among U.S. historians right now, there is a bit of a debate going on about whether or not it is right to use that term, the G word. Benjamin Madley, in his forthcoming book, American Genocide, argues definitively that it is. Brandon Lindsay, in Murder State, argues, yes, but it was genocide from the bottom up. Gary Clayton Anderson, in Ethnic Cleansing in the Indian, The Crime That Should Haunt America, argues that genocide is not the right term, but rather that we should understand American history as one of ethnic cleansing. Whatever. In this ongoing debate, one thing strikes me, though. When asking, was it genocide, yes or no, or the much more annoying question, is genocide too political a term, is it ahistorical, is the definition too narrow or inappropriate to be applied to X, Y, or Z situation? The question we should ask is not genocide, yes or no, but how? How did indigenous people survive in the face of genocidal violence? How did they thrive even as society imagined them doomed to extinction? What strategies did they use to reconstruct their cultures, families, personal lives in the aftermath of genocidal violence? How do we tell a different story about indigenous survival in American history? It's not all a history of destruction. It's also a history of survival, persistence, and above all, creation and regeneration. That is the history of indigenous people in the United States that I want to see written. Not one that focuses solely on the instruments of state that led to their destruction, but one that talks about the creation. Survival alone is not enough. Native peoples created something. Professor Dunbar-Ortiz also puts settler colonialism straightforward into the narrative. I think that's really important. The United States, though, is not the only settler colonial state in the world, and theirs is not a monopoly on the violence or the foundational myth of indigenous extinction. Standing here today on the ceded territory of the Credit River, Mississauga, and the ancestral territory of many indigenous peoples, we should not imagine the United States as somehow exceptional. As Canadians, we too have a very dark history, which we must reckon with. Settler colonialism, Roxanne says, is a genocidal policy. And indigenous survival, she says, is often the most powerful form of resistance. But what about what was created? what was invented. Today, here in Canada, we are gathered to discuss the history of Indigenous people in the United States. I admonish you all to remember that you are not tourists of history, observing it or consuming it once removed. After all, we are all standing on a moving train. Thank you.